whoever would like to do this might want to start taking little notes so that they can help themselves. But anybody want to start? Rob, as you see this, I think you've seen these. Is there anything that you had on your slides that was sort of missing here? Or others?
Can you put up the goals again? So
yeah, I can. Oh, Andrew, are you still there? He's
yeah, I'll pull those.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll start out, Pam. I mean, you know, a lot, these if words are important, you know, the word decentralized, I think, has gotten, I think a lot of people, in my view, a lot of people misunderstand what the main application of that is. If democratize, you know, is more of the way I think about it. A lot of people, when they hear decentralized, they think about purely decentralized clinical trials that don't have an investigator and don't have a research site. And I don't think that's the way most serious disease trials are going to get done. But definitely using digital technologies to make trials available in a hybridized fashion, I guess is the term most of us are using now.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I have heard that come up increasingly. And somebody's asking if you can zoom that. I have a huge monitor, so I can read it fine, but I don't know if others might need some.
Yeah, you know, the FDA has this preference to the decentralized clinical trial verbiage over virtual, which that came out, I guess, in December-ish type timetable. And it's been a challenge, right? Because we've had to always then keep defining it and redefining it, that it means hybrid, that it means a wide range of things across a wide range of sites. So I think that's a good call out, because it kind of gets in the way from people understanding, you know, what we're talking about. You know, it does strike me from Robert, your comments, that something that's missing here is the tools for technologies to be interconnected. The standardization, we talked a little bit about the FHIR HL7, but sites are telling us in the clinical trials we run that they're very frustrated, right? They want the tools to work with whatever standards they have. Just like we saw that movement with EHRs and technologies that could work across, and Sam, who's on this group, from Datavant, knows that importance of connecting data. But that seems like an area that we really need to maybe add to the list.
Just sort of what are the priority kind of things that need to be in place for this to work well. And I think Rob mentioned the sort of ethics issues around, you know, privacy and things like that, and maybe data standardization. That would make life a whole lot easier, I think.
Right.
Yeah. Might be one of those interim actions we need to kind of finally get together before 2025.
We need to make it easier for sites. They're really strained at the moment. And so when we require them for each of our studies to use different technologies, because that's what we've all standardized on, it creates a new set of challenges.
Yeah.
I think just to build on that point a bit, you know, there's a lot of rightful discussion around how do we hybridize clinical care in clinical trials. What's good for one is often good for the other. You know, appropriate record keeping, ensuring that you are providing continuity of care for the patient. But the way that our systems interoperate for those two really falls tremendously short, as Peyton just mentioned on the standard side. But, you know, I think with some of the new interoperability standards that are coming out through ONC, through CMS, there is some promise. But we also have room to go, particularly with, you know, how do we go beyond read permissions to write permissions to make sure that the clinician who is actually treating the patient is able to get the results that they might need from the central lab for a particular study to provide continuity of care and not need to revert to an EDC. You know, as we work with EHR vendors as stakeholders in this as well, you know, you can envision a scenario where, as they're working through their existing workflows, they see research as a care option pop up as the various data ingested suggest eligibility for a trial that they or an adjacent institution might be sponsoring or might be supporting. And so I think that there's things that we can do with existing technology, and it's incumbent on us to realize where are those able to provide fit for purpose data to truly reach trials that are going to tell us something, but also where it doesn't. What are the partnerships that we need to create? What are the technologies that we need to invest in to make sure that we are expanding the domain of where using these data sets that are captured through existing systems can be translated into the trial enterprise.
Great points. Anyone else want to jump in? It looks like what they've combined is pretty comprehensive, and maybe there's a little bit more thought around how to define decentralized clinical trials, or sort of get that concept across. And then this idea of standardization are maybe things that could be potentially added. With that in mind, maybe this time we can get to the long-term goals for this session. What are sort of the shorter term goals and actions that can be taken that will be critical, say, in 3 to 4 years to move this forward?
Well, Pam, these are such broad statements. I mean, digital tools for clinical trials management. Okay. It's hard to be opposed to that. It would seem like there would be a great benefit of breaking these down into bullets of some kind. I also really just want to bring back my 3 concerns, which I just don't think the issue is really technology anymore. The technology, we all use technology from the time to wake us up, and then most of us until we go to bed, except when we do clinical trials where we use it very clumsily. And I think the impeding factors are not technology. They're the way we regulate it and the way we think about it with regard to ethics and business models.
Well, as usual, the devil is in the detail. You're exactly right about that. And it's changing the way you do things. I mean, we talked about that earlier in change management, and we seem to do it all right in other places, but somehow have a harder time doing it in clinical trials. I don't know who of you still prints a boarding pass, or travels for that matter, maybe, but if you think about it that way, it does make you think a bit.
One of the things that we have at the consortium is AI machine learning group, a community of practice group. And really the purpose of that is to get people in clinical operations comfortable with the concept of how technology can help them do their job. What are examples? How, there's been a lot of discussion there around upskilling people that are going to help develop things, because there's a bit of a disconnect at times. Sure, there's lots of technology that can do lots of things, but when you go and you talk to the people that are going to need to use it and help design it, they're afraid that, machines are going to take over. I'm not going to have a job. And there's all these sort of underlying human concerns in addition to the ethics and regulatory stuff that, should not be underestimated. So we're finding people are excited to learn more, become more comfortable, understand that, it can do some of these mundane things that, make your life miserable, et cetera. But we're not at all at a place where a lot of people that need to be involved with the discussion are comfortable from what we're seeing.
I see a lot of nodding heads. Joe, do you want to add on to that? I know you've done some work in this space too with. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, Joe Sheeran, I think you're doing some work with. I
think that the comments which we made were great comments in terms of I think the standardization is really one of the key elements in order to make this work. Although with the venue of artificial intelligence and machine learning, you can now easily construct translation tools which permit to translate from one standard to the other. But to give you an example, within our organization, we have counted something like 23 different ways in order to note a birthday, which gives you a little bit of an idea in terms of how big this problem is and how big the challenge is in order to overcome it. I think it is not, and then if we want to do it, we have to do it on a global basis, which makes it an even bigger challenge in order to overcome. As you know, we are working on a rare disease cures accelerated data analytics platform. And so we have started to work on ontologies. What we have seen is that some regions are more advanced in determining these than in the US. And so we are piggybacking on that in order to implement those. The same way I was thinking about electronic health records, there are countries which have a better system in place than in the US in order to capture the data from patients. You only have to look at, for example, Denmark. Although it's a very small country, and it's probably much easier to harmonize and standardize data, I think we could maybe learn something from those countries and transport that learning to the US.
Yeah, and I think that's true. And the learning is really important from other systems. Any other thoughts around that?
I wanted to make an additional comment here because
Sure.
in Japan, they have a data management and data system which they have put in place in a couple of hospitals. I believe something like 23 hospitals were involved in that, or are involved in that, at least 2 years ago when I last have seen about this. What they did there was they trained the people to bring the data into the system. And one of the things which they managed to do was that they got from an error rate of something like 30% to an error rate of something like 0.5%. So there is also work to be done with the community in order to make this happen. Not all the data will be, of course, have to be put into by hand. And the more we can do by electronic means, the better it is. But not all will be available in electronic fashion in order to do this.
Yeah, it reminds me of the comment I think somebody made about bringing the question to the data rather than the data to the question, which kind of ties in like, do we need better data entry versus do we standardize things and are able to use data that's already available? You know, it kind of comes back to that a little bit. What are some of the actions that we can do to get us closer to that? I mean, I know Fire HL7, they've been working tirelessly. You know, how do you scale that? It goes back to scaling. I think we talked about earlier things like how do you scale those efforts so they become the norm rather than pockets here and there? Is it incentives that need to be aligned? Is it?
So
It's always sticks and carrots, and a little bit of law. Now there's there's a lot of talk about a Cures 2.0 legislation. So if, this group, can't make policy recommendations, but it can certainly frame ideas about the right policy recommendations. I mean, we wouldn't all have EHRs today, for better or worse, if not for the Recovery Act that incentivized everyone to put them in place. And I think at the core of what Janet was saying, which I completely agree with, our early phase clinical trials, maybe that doesn't need a lot of work because you have to do a lot of the detail work that's being done. But our system for phase 3 and beyond is just extraordinarily awkward and expensive. And it may be that the creation of some funded incentives to have people get organized in some way could make a big difference. And, then maybe we wouldn't have, 80 treatments for COVID, none of which work, and then 3 that finally do work after the trials finally get done with slow enrollment because all the patients were going into small trials that couldn't answer the questions.
Anybody want to add to that? So I think incentives matter.
Incentives for interoperability would be one that matters. And maybe back to our first discussion, more clarity from regulators on some of these more innovative techniques. An example would be we've used real world evidence to create synthetic control arms, and it's been very difficult to get sponsors to take the risk, right, to move forward with those pathways when they're fantastic study designs from a patient perspective, a recruiting perspective, speed, like all, reduce costs, all the things we care about, but they don't feel like they have clear guidance, and so they're afraid, basically. So it's a very challenging situation, and the large pharma have been much more difficult to go there because of it, which makes sense.
Yeah. I
think that's my, my cue. I've been waiting to make a comment, but I can't tie it together to anything. So, that's the segue. Because I think what's awesome, what's really interesting now, and I do a lot of with the UC COVID data set cords, is that, you don't have the data. So I think, that's what's really interesting, that is the data, sits in this server that everybody has access to. And it's amazing in terms of every week there's a new refresh, and I can watch that pipeline, that data lake become more robust without me doing really anything, just making sure that I can get into that server. But I think it's kind of wrapping our mind around the notion of, that you don't have the data. It is somewhere. We can analyze it. We can pressure test it. We can QC it.
I think John Frost
have it. And so, some researchers call it that notion of, it's going to continue to be strengthened, but sorry, I lost it. Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yeah, you're back, but you were cutting out a little bit. But I think if you were to summarize what you were saying, is it sort of the data accessibility or?
Yeah, for better or for worse, it's that some people are, that if you know how the access points, basically how to get to the pipes, it's never been better than ever. But I think getting comfortable with that, as well as it also relates to a comment that Joe made, a lot of these data sets, in order to make it safe and to make it so it's IRB exempt, we remove there is no date of birth in the data set I use. There's birth year, right? And so it's like the ways to make this data set more accessible. There is some texture that you lose, but I don't know if these are mostly good things, but I think that it's getting everybody comfortable that how we're going to do it needs to be different, given the potential environment for getting at the data. This is great because it's a lot safer, theoretically, to do some of these analytics and to do them rapidly. I think Rob has always made really good points that can lead you to do some analyses you shouldn't do so fast, because that you are waiting for the data to come in to validate that. I've seen that as well. So I think we really have to define the best practices and really know that the rapidity to do those analyses can sometimes be the impediment for getting things that are valid. But I think it's some of these, we need to get better at best practices for familiarity almost.
Yeah, John, tell me if you agree with this or not, but I mean, one of the beauties now is the technology allows complete data provenance and analytical provenance. So there's a record of every step that you take when you use that UC system, which means that if you are doing lousy analyses or cheating or whatever, you're like a thief that left the footprint, on the floor of the store. So, and I think the idea is that individual investigators with their data sets don't have access to the technology that makes those things so robust. And I mean, the other thing is, the people getting at care in the University of California system, probably only a few of them have any idea that their data is being used this way, but it's a tremendous public good. And so working on this, getting this right, I think is really important.
One small thing I might add onto that is, I think as we look beyond pockets of groups like the UC to the nation more broadly, we need to invest in our systems for aggregating data that is fit for purpose for clinical trials. Much of the data that is kind of out there in common circulation, has been designed for the purpose that there are dollars for, which is kind of commercial operations, targeting a sales force. And a lot of times the unit that you care about with that data is the unit of a provider, the unit of a hospital, so you can track market share, so that you can understand that institution's experience and go in with the right marketing messages. But whenever we shift over to the clinical trial context, we care about the unit of the patient. We care about the completeness of the record. We can care about, do we get the right richness of the data, and have we controlled for both the type 1 and 2 error in collecting it to be able to confidently use that data to inform the endpoints for our study. And so I think that one of the things that the technology is there, but we've got room to go on the business models to pull that data from the places where it's being held and help match a cohort of patients to their real world data sets.
Is it also a matter of the right data for the right question? Like, I think you kind of alluded to that you don't need like every last detail for certain questions, where for some you really do, and it's a slightly different construct, right?
Exactly. I think there's a lot of, it's important to recognize that, real world data is not a panacea. It's not going to, replace the way that we do clinical trials today, but it can be a very powerful supplement. And the question is, where can we get clean insights from existing data in an efficient manner? Or where can we apply predictable curation techniques to clean up the insights from data that might not be clean where it rests, with the appropriate, as Rob had mentioned, the appropriate provenance tracking and change log on the analytical side, so that when folks are reviewing it, they can confidently see how that data was processed and the evidence supporting those processing techniques.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of good sense. I want to see if somebody on the phone or not on video has any comments, because it's a little easier for me to look at the faces and kind of see when somebody's nodding or something. If they want to add something, it's a little harder on the phone. I'll just pause for a second now. And thanks, Sam, for volunteering to report out. I don't know how you guys do it, because these are such far-reaching conversations. To turn them into some points that make sense is really hard. So thanks for all three of you that will have done this. Any new stakeholders that need to be involved in this? I mean, as we think about the short-term actions, I feel like might not be talking about new stakeholders, or is there somebody out there that we don't know about that should be included?
I guess the ones that I could think of that are interesting, I don't know if it's necessarily new stakeholders, but it's again, everything is kind of based on this bizarre COVID experience in terms of the data. It's that and how fast you can get it. It kind of relates to what Rob was saying. Is I'm in some of my data probably, but I don't know it, and so I think getting our minds wrapped around that what the patient experience is, knowing that their data is part of this. That's probably some element that I think we just have to address, because somebody is going to ask, and then they may ask that they don't have it, or that they don't want to be included. I think that's one. And then another one that relates to the same is how the data feeds kind of go. There's situations where a health system or a hospital can just choose oh, I don't want to report on these patients, right? It's just like and this is after they've begun initially submitting that data, but there's something done after the kind of registry has started. And so what's interesting is that sometimes you think you've got all the data, but there's certainly places that feed into the data lake that can decide how they're going to modify that spigot. And so I think it's understanding that really what the potential limitations that can be imposed. So I think it's just really comes down to understanding. I think transparency is we say we want transparency, but there's so much that you can make it transparent and you still probably wouldn't understand it. And so I think that there's an awareness the known unknowns, the unknown, there's some things we just need to learn.
And you did bring up a stakeholder that we hadn't really talked about all that much, which are the health systems, which are holding a lot of this data that probably need to be brought in more into the research discussion and how it can become a win-win situation for everyone, I mean, I don't know what the carrots and the sticks are there, but.
I think
If we go back to the decentralized trials for a second, or the virtual trials, whatever people want to call them, we certainly have been talking a lot in our consortium around how the COVID trials were run, and remote and offsite and centralized monitoring. And I think there's a huge amount to learn about what worked there, what didn't work there, what the barriers were. There certainly were quite a few barriers. I think we got everybody to the point where they said, gee, this stuff is, we're comfortable not going on site to look at things, but that access to information and how it actually got operationalized has really varied across the board. And I think before we can really successfully move forward with how do we apply these in the future, we've got to do a deeper dive into how do we get that to work better.